I used to think silence was peaceful, you know, that kind of quiet that settles over a house in the early morning when the world hasn't quite woken up yet and everything feels suspended in possibility. But sitting here now, in the same kitchen where Sarah used to make her terrible coffee, too strong, always too strong, I've learned that silence can be the heaviest thing you'll ever carry. It's been 3 months since she left. 3 months since I watched her pack her life into boxes, each item a small betrayal of the future we'd imagined together. The coffee maker is still here though. She forgot it, or maybe she left it on purpose. I haven't decided which would hurt more. My mother always said I overthink everything. Michael, you analyze a smile until it disappears, she'd tell me when I was younger, usually while I sat at this same kitchen table, staring out the window and trying to make sense of why things happened the way they did. I guess some habits never change. The morning light filters through the blinds in those familiar golden strips, the same way it did when Sarah would sit across from me, scrolling through her phone while eating toast cut into perfect triangles. She had this ritual about it, never squares, always triangles, and she'd eat the pointed ends first. I used to find it endearing. Now I wonder if I ever really knew her at all. David called yesterday. My older brother has this way of checking in that feels more like surveillance than concern, asking careful questions that dance around what he really wants to know. "How are you holding up?" he asked, and I could hear Emily in the background, probably mouthing words for him to say. My sister has always been better at emotions than either of us. "I'm fine," I told him, which is what you say when you're anything but fine, and everyone knows it. The truth is, I've been sitting in this kitchen every morning for 3 months, drinking coffee that actually tastes good now that I make it properly, and trying to understand how someone can share your bed for 2 years and still remain a complete mystery. Sarah had this way of looking at you when you were talking, like she was filing away everything you said for later examination. I thought it meant she was listening. I thought it meant she cared. I should have known then that something was wrong. When someone looks at you like you're a puzzle they're trying to solve instead of a person they're trying to love, maybe the problem isn't the puzzle, maybe the problem is that they already know the solution and they're just waiting for the right moment to tell you. Looking back now, I can see the blueprint of our relationship laid out like architectural plans, all clean lines and measured spaces, beautiful from a distance but missing something essential up close. Sarah and I met at Emily's birthday party 2 years ago, one of those casual gatherings that somehow become significant in retrospect. She was standing by the bookshelf in Emily's living room, actually reading the spines instead of just pretending to, and when I approached her, she didn't do that thing people do at parties where they look over your shoulder for someone more interesting. She looked at me like I was worth her full attention. "Your sister has excellent taste in books," she said, pulling out a worn copy of something I'd never heard of. "Most people just buy books to look intellectual." "How do you know they're not just for show?" I asked, genuinely curious. She smiled then, this soft knowing smile that I would learn to both love and fear, because half of them have broken spines and margin notes. Books that get read look different than books that get displayed. That should have been my first clue about Sarah. She noticed things. The kind of things that other people missed, details that revealed more than most conversations ever could. She saw the world like a detective sees a crime scene, cataloging evidence of who people really were beneath their carefully constructed surfaces. We talked for 3 hours that night, long after most of the party had moved to the kitchen or spilled out onto Emily's tiny balcony. Sarah told me about her job at the marketing firm, how she spent her days crafting messages designed to make people want things they didn't need. "It's surprisingly similar to therapy," she said, "except in reverse. Instead of helping people understand their motivations, I'm creating new ones." I told her about my work as a graphic designer. How I liked the precision of it, the way you could take something chaotic and organize it into something beautiful and functional. She listened in that intense way of hers, like she was absorbing not just my words, but the spaces between them. "You like control," she observed, not judgmentally, just stating a fact. "I like things to make sense," I corrected. "Same thing," she said, and she wasn't wrong. My family liked her immediately, which should have been reassuring but somehow made me nervous instead. Sarah had this way of becoming exactly what each person needed her to be. With Mom, she was respectful and interested in family stories. With David, she was sharp and funny, matching his wit without threatening his need to be the smartest person in the room. With Emily, she was warm and sisterly, asking about her photography and remembering small details from previous conversations. "She's perfect for you," Emily told me after Sarah's first family dinner, and the certainty in her voice made my stomach twist in a way I couldn't explain. But I was still naive about what love really meant. I thought it was about compatibility, about finding someone who fit neatly into the life you'd already built. I didn't understand yet that real love requires you to rebuild everything, to let someone change the fundamental architecture of who you are. Sarah fit into my life so seamlessly that I never questioned whether I was changing to accommodate her or whether she was simply performing a version of herself that required no change from me at all. The early months were easy in a way that should have been suspicious. We liked the same movies, enjoyed the same restaurants, shared similar views on most important topics. Our disagreements were minor and easily resolved. She integrated into my friend group without drama, got along with my co-workers at social events, even helped me organize my apartment in ways that made it more functional and aesthetically pleasing. "You're lucky," my friend Jake told me once. "Sarah's like the ideal girlfriend, smart, beautiful, gets along with everyone, doesn't create any problems." Doesn't create any problems. At the time, I took it as a compliment. Now I understand it was a warning I was too inexperienced to recognize. Our relationship had seasons, like a garden we tended together, each phase bringing its own beauty and its own hidden complications. The spring was those first 6 months when everything felt new and full of possibility. Sarah would leave little notes in my laptop bag, simple things like, "Have a good day," or, "Thinking of you," written in her careful handwriting on whatever scrap of paper she could find. I started keeping a drawer full of those notes, which probably should have embarrassed me, but didn't. There was something about the physical proof of her attention that I found addictive. In a world where most communication happened through screens, Sarah's handwritten words felt deliberate and real. She had opinions about everything: movies, music, the way I arranged my furniture, the coffee shop we should go to on Sunday mornings. Not demanding opinions, just gentle observations that somehow became the foundation for all our decisions. "I think the couch would look better at an angle," she'd say, and within a week, we'd be rearranging my entire living room. "We" had become my favorite word without me realizing it. "We're going to try that new restaurant. We should probably leave soon. We could watch something else if you want." The transformation from I to we happened so gradually that I didn't notice the shape of my life changing to accommodate this new plural existence. Summer brought vacations and meeting each other's extended families. Sarah's parents lived in a perfectly maintained suburban house where everything had its place and conversations followed unspoken rules about appropriate topics and timing. Her father, Mr. Williams, was the kind of man who measured his words carefully, as if each sentence was being recorded for posterity. "Michael seems like a good young man," he told Sarah within my hearing, which I understood was his version of enthusiastic approval. Her mother had died when Sarah was 16, something she mentioned once in passing and never discussed again. I learned not to ask about it directly, instead gathering information from context clues and careful observation. There were photos throughout the house that stopped abruptly when Sarah was a teenager, and a certain quality of preserved perfection in her childhood bedroom that suggested a shrine more than a living space. "Dad doesn't like change," Sarah explained when I commented on how nothing seemed to have been moved since her high school graduation. "After Mom died, he decided everything should stay exactly the same. I think he believes that if he changes anything, he'll lose the rest of her too." That was one of the most revealing things she ever said about herself, though I didn't understand its significance at the time. Sarah lived in a house where love was expressed through preservation, where caring for someone meant keeping them exactly as they were. No wonder she seemed so comfortable with our easy compatibility. No wonder change felt threatening instead of exciting. Looking back, the signs were always there. The way she never left anything at my apartment unless I specifically asked her to. The way she deflected most of my questions about her childhood with charming stories that revealed nothing meaningful. The way she never seemed to need anything from me emotionally, no comfort during bad days, no celebration during good ones, no messy human moments that required genuine vulnerability. I thought I was dating someone remarkably self-sufficient and emotionally mature. I didn't realize I was dating someone who had learned that needing people was dangerous, that the safest way to love someone was to never let them see who you really were. The autumn of our relationship brought cohabitation discussions and talk of the future. Sarah approached these conversations like business meetings, practical and organized. We made lists of our financial goals, discussed our career timelines, even talked about children in the abstract way you might discuss a home renovation project that's several years away. "I think we work well together," she said one evening while we were planning a weekend trip to visit David and his wife. "We want similar things, we don't fight, we make each other better." Make each other better. I loved that phrase, the idea that love was about improvement rather than just acceptance. But I was beginning to understand that improvement implied there was something wrong with who we were individually, something that needed fixing or enhancement. I kept telling myself everything was fine, better than fine. We were building something stable and lasting, the kind of relationship that people envied. But late at night, when Sarah was asleep beside me, I would sometimes stare at the ceiling and try to remember the last time she had surprised me, the last time she had revealed something about herself that I hadn't already guessed or carefully deduced. David came to visit on a Thursday in October, one of those crisp fall days when the light slants through windows at new angles and everything looks different even though nothing has actually changed. He was supposed to stay for just dinner, but Sarah insisted he spend the night in our guest room, and something about the way she made the offer, too enthusiastic, too accommodating, made me pay attention in a way I usually didn't. My brother has always been the successful one, the one who figured out early that life was a game with rules that could be learned and mastered. At 30, he already owned his own consulting firm, lived in a house with a 2-car garage and a landscaped yard, and had married Rebecca, a woman who seemed to exist in a constant state of cheerful efficiency. "You two have a nice place," David said, looking around our living room with the appraising eye he brought to everything. "Very coordinated." Sarah beamed at the compliment, but I heard something else in his tone, a subtle question mark that made me see our apartment through his eyes. Everything did match, almost suspiciously well. The throw pillows coordinated with the curtains, which complemented the area rug, which tied together the color scheme of the entire room. It looked like a magazine spread, beautiful and impersonal. During dinner, I watched David watching Sarah, and I could see him cataloging details the way he did when he was evaluating a potential business partner. He asked her about her work, her family, her thoughts on various topics, and she responded with the kind of articulate, well-reasoned answers that revealed nothing about who she actually was. "Sarah's incredibly organized," I said at one point, trying to fill a silence that had stretched a beat too long. "She's completely transformed how I think about managing time and space." "That's wonderful," David said, but he tried. He was looking at me when he said it, not her. It's important to find someone who helps you grow. After Sarah went to bed, David and I sat on the balcony drinking the expensive whiskey he'd brought, something he did whenever he wanted to have what he called a real conversation. "She's lovely," he said, and I waited because David never led with his actual opinion. "But," I prompted. "No, but, she's lovely, intelligent, attractive, clearly cares about you." He swirled his whiskey thoughtfully. "It's just, do you ever feel like you're dating a very sophisticated computer program?" The question hit me like cold water. "What do you mean?" "She says all the right things, responds appropriately to every social cue, never seems to have a bad day or an unreasonable opinion about anything." He looked at me carefully. "Don't get me wrong, those are admirable qualities, it's just that most people are a little more complicated." I wanted to defend Sarah, to list all the ways she was uniquely human and wonderful, but the examples that came to mind felt thin and generic. She made good coffee, she remembered people's birthdays, she never left dishes in the sink. "Maybe she's just emotionally mature," I said. "Maybe," David agreed, but I could hear the doubt in his voice. "Or maybe she's very good at being who she thinks you want her to be." That night, I lay awake listening to Sarah breathe beside me, and I tried to remember the last time she had been unreasonable or difficult or simply human in the messy, imperfect way that people usually are. The last time she had needed comfort or support or just someone to listen while she worked through a problem. The last time she had let me see her without her careful composure intact. I kept telling myself everything was fine, that David was just being paranoid in the way that successful people sometimes are, always looking for problems to solve. But his words had planted a seed of doubt that grew in the dark spaces of my mind, fed by small observations I had been unconsciously collecting for months. The way Sarah never seemed to have strong preferences about anything that mattered, The way she deflected personal questions with charming stories or thoughtful observations about other topics. The way she fit so perfectly into my life that it was as if she had studied the role of Michael's girlfriend and was performing it flawlessly. Mrs. Johnson, my mother, called the next morning while Sarah was in the shower. "How's David's visit going?" she asked. "Good, he likes Sarah." "Of course he does, she's very likable." There was something in Mom's tone that made me wonder if she had been talking to David. "Are you happy, sweetheart?" The question caught me off guard. "Of course, why wouldn't I be?" "No reason, you just seem, I don't know, like you're working very hard at something that should feel easier." After we hung up, I stood in the kitchen holding my phone and wondering when the people who knew me best had started asking questions I couldn't answer. November brought the first real crack in our perfect facade, though at the time I dismissed it as a minor misunderstanding rather than the warning it actually was. Sarah had been acting differently for a few days, more distant, more preoccupied, and when I asked if everything was okay, she gave me one of her practiced smiles and said she was just busy with work. But then Jessica called. Sarah's best friend had this way of cutting through social niceties that I both admired and found slightly terrifying. She said exactly what she thought, consequences be damned, which made her the perfect foil for Sarah's careful diplomacy. "Is Sarah avoiding me?" Jessica asked without preamble when I answered Sarah's phone by mistake. "Because I've been trying to reach her for a week, and she keeps making excuses not to get together." "I don't think she's avoiding you," I said, though even as I said it, I realized I had no idea what Sarah's social life looked like outside of our shared activities. "She's been working a lot lately." "Sarah's always working, that's never stopped her from maintaining friendships before." Jessica's voice carried a note of frustration that made me pay attention. "Look, I don't want to put you in the middle of something, but has she seemed, I don't know, different to you lately?" The question hung in the air between us, loaded with implications I wasn't ready to examine. "Different how?" "More secretive. More careful about what she says." Jessica paused, and I could hear her weighing her words. "We've been friends since college, and I've never had to work this hard to figure out what's going on in her life." After we hung up, I found myself paying attention to Sarah's phone habits in a way that felt invasive but necessary. She had always been private about her communications, but now I noticed how she angled her screen away from me when texting, how she stepped into another room to take certain calls, how she seemed to have conversations that stopped abruptly when I entered a room. "Who was that?" I asked one evening after she finished a call that had involved a lot of whispered, "I know," and "we'll figure it out" responses. "Just work stuff," she said, but she wouldn't meet my eyes. I wanted to press the issue, to ask the direct questions that were building up in my chest like water behind a dam, but something about Sarah's demeanor warned me off. She had this way of retreating when she felt cornered, becoming even more polite and accommodating while simultaneously creating distance that felt impossible to bridge. Instead, I found myself becoming a detective in my own relationship, paying attention to details I had previously ignored. The way Sarah's schedule seemed to have new gaps that she filled with vague explanations about errands or meetings, the way she had started suggesting we spend Friday nights at home instead of going out with friends, the way she deflected questions about her day with practiced efficiency. "Everything okay with you lately?" Emily asked during one of our weekly coffee dates. "You seem distracted." My sister had always been perceptive, able to read moods and undercurrents with an accuracy that sometimes felt supernatural. I wanted to confide in her, to share the growing sense that something fundamental was shifting in my relationship with Sarah, but I didn't know how to articulate concerns that felt more like instincts than facts. "Just work stress," I said, using Sarah's favorite deflection technique. Emily studied my face with the kind of focused attention she usually reserved for her photography subjects. "You know you can talk to me about anything, right? Even if it's complicated or messy or doesn't make complete sense yet." The invitation hung between us, and I felt the weight of all the conversations I wasn't having, all the questions I wasn't asking, all the doubts I was carefully filing away instead of examining. But acknowledging them out loud would make them real, and I wasn't ready for that level of reality yet. That's when I started questioning everything, though I didn't admit it to myself at the time. Instead, I told myself I was being paranoid, that the stress of work and the approaching holidays was making me oversensitive to normal fluctuations in relationship dynamics. But late at night, when Sarah was asleep beside me, I would stare at the ceiling and try to remember the last time we had talked about something that mattered. Really talked, not just exchanged information or made plans or discussed practical matters. The last time either of us had been vulnerable or uncertain or genuinely curious about the other person's inner world. The last time our relationship had felt like a conversation between two people who were genuinely interested in knowing each other, rather than a carefully choreographed performance designed to maintain the appearance of perfect compatibility. December settled over our relationship like fog, obscuring familiar landmarks and making everything feel uncertain and strange. Sarah had grown quieter, more thoughtful, spending long periods staring out windows or scrolling through her phone with an expression I couldn't read. When I asked what she was thinking about, she would give me a smile that didn't reach her eyes and say, "Nothing important." Nothing important. Those words became a refrain that followed me through my days, a reminder of how little access I seemed to have to Sarah's actual thoughts and feelings. We still went through the motions of our shared life, grocery shopping, dinner preparation, Netflix marathons on the couch, but there was a quality of performance to it all, as if we were both acting out roles we had memorized but no longer felt. "Are we okay?" I asked one evening while we were doing dishes, a question that felt both necessary and dangerous. Sarah paused with a wet plate in her hands, considering her response with the kind of careful deliberation she brought to everything these days. "Of course we're okay. Why would you ask that? You seem distant lately, preoccupied." "I'm not distant," she said, but she was looking at the plate instead of at me. "I'm just thinking about some things." "What kinds of things?" "Work things, family things, life things." She rinsed the plate with unnecessary thoroughness. "Nothing you need to worry about." "Nothing you need to worry about." Another phrase that lodged itself in my chest like a splinter, small but persistently painful. When had we become the kind of couple who protected each other from worry instead of sharing it? When had her problems become something to shield me from rather than something we faced together? I felt like I was losing her, but I didn't know why. There was no obvious crisis, no dramatic conflict, no clear moment when things had changed. Instead, there was just this gradual erosion of intimacy, like watching a shoreline disappear one grain of sand at a time. Jessica called again, this time when Sarah was in the shower, and I made the mistake of answering her phone. "Thank God," she said. "I was starting to think Sarah had blocked my number." "She wouldn't block your number," I said, though I realized I had no idea what Sarah would or wouldn't do anymore. "Michael, can I ask you something? And I need you to be honest with me, okay?" "Okay. Is Sarah seeing someone else?" The question hit me like a physical blow, not because I hadn't considered the possibility, but because hearing it spoken out loud made it real in a way that my private doubts never had. "What makes you ask that?" "She's been acting like someone with a secret, and not a good secret, like a surprise party or a new job, a complicated secret that's eating her up from the inside." Jessica's voice was gentle but insistent. "I've known her for 8 years, Michael. This isn't just work stress or family stuff, this is something bigger." After we hung up, I sat on the edge of the bed and tried to process what Jessica had said. The idea of Sarah having an affair felt both impossible and inevitable. Impossible because she was so careful, so ethical, so committed to doing the right thing, but inevitable because what other explanation could there be for the distance that had grown between us like a cancer? I started paying attention to her behavior with the focused intensity of a scientist conducting an experiment. The way she guarded her phone, the way she made plans without consulting me, the way she seemed to have entire emotional experiences that didn't include me at all. But it wasn't until I found the email that everything finally made sense. Sarah had asked me to print something from her laptop while she was getting ready for work, something about a presentation she needed for a client meeting. The email was open in her browser, not to me but from someone named Alex, and even though I knew I shouldn't read it, even though I knew it was a violation of privacy and trust, I found myself scanning the words before I could stop myself. "I know this is complicated," the email said, "but we can't keep pretending this isn't happening. You have to make a choice, Sarah. You can't have both." My hands were shaking as I printed Sarah's presentation, my mind racing through possibilities and explanations, each one worse than the last. Who was Alex? What choice was Sarah supposed to make? And what did "you can't have both" mean in the context of our relationship? I wanted to confront her immediately, to demand answers and explanations, but something held me back. Maybe it was fear of what I might learn, or maybe it was the knowledge that once I asked the question, there would be no going back to the comfortable ignorance I had been living in. Instead, I went to work and spent the day in a haze of anxiety and speculation, my mind cycling through scenarios that ranged from the merely painful to the completely devastating. By the time I got home, I had worked myself into a state of barely controlled panic. Sarah was in the kitchen making dinner, moving through the familiar motions with the same careful precision she brought to everything. She looked up when I walked in, and for a moment, her expression was open and unguarded, the way it used to be before everything became complicated. "How was your day?" she asked, and the normalcy of the question felt like cruelty. "Fine," I said, though nothing had been fine for months. That night, I lay awake beside her and tried to decide whether to ask about Alex, whether to de-eyes the truth that I was increasingly certain would destroy everything we had built together. Part of me wanted to cling to the uncertainty, to exist in the space between knowing and not knowing for as long as possible. But I was beginning to understand that ignorance was its own kind of prison, and I was tired of being a captive in my own life. The weekend brought an unexpected visitor that would change everything, though I didn't realize it at the time. Mrs. Johnson called Saturday morning to say she was dropping by with some of my childhood things she'd found while cleaning the attic. Mom had been talking about downsizing for months, one of those projects that seemed to exist more in conversation than in reality, but apparently she'd finally made some progress. Sarah seemed unusually nervous about my mother's visit, fussing with the apartment in ways that were unnecessary but revealing. She changed clothes twice, rearranged the coffee table books, and asked me 3 times if I thought we should have gotten pastries from the bakery down the street. "It's just my mom," I said, watching her straighten magazines that were already perfectly aligned. "She's not coming to judge our hosting abilities." "I know," Sarah said, but she was smoothing her hair in the hallway mirror for the second time in 5 minutes. "I just want everything to be nice." When Mom arrived with her box of childhood memorabilia, Sarah greeted her with the kind of warm enthusiasm she usually reserved for first meetings, as if they didn't already know each other well. It was a small thing, but it added to the growing collection of small things that didn't quite make sense. "I found Michael's old journals," Mom said, settling into our couch with the satisfied sigh of someone who had accomplished a meaningful task. "I thought he might want them, though I can't imagine why anyone would want to remember being 13. The journals were a revelation I had forgotten existed. 5 slim notebooks filled with the earnest observations and confused emotions of my teenage years. Mom had wrapped them in tissue paper, treating them with the kind of reverent care usually reserved for family heirlooms. "Oh God," I said, flipping through pages of in-key, reasoningly horrific handwriting and existential angst. "Please tell me you didn't read these." "Of course I read them," Mom said with unrepentant pride. "You were such a thoughtful boy. Always trying to figure out why people did what they did, always looking for patterns and explanations." Sarah picked up one of the journals, handling it with the careful attention she brought to everything that might reveal something significant. "May I?" she asked, and I nodded, though something about her interest made me uncomfortable. She read silently for several minutes, her expression growing more concentrated with each page. I tried to remember what I had written about at 13. What insights or embarrassments might be lurking in those adolescent observations. "Listen to this," Sarah said, and began reading in a voice that somehow made my teenage writing sound more profound than it had any right to be. "I think people wear masks not to hide from other people, but to hide from themselves. If you pretend to be someone long enough, maybe you forget who you really were underneath." The words hit me with unexpected force, not because they were particularly wise, they weren't, but because they felt prophetic in a way that made my chest tight. I had written them 15 years ago, but they seemed to describe something that was happening right now, in this room, in this relationship. "Wise words," Mom said, but she was looking at Sarah when she said it. After Mom left, Sarah seemed different, more subdued and thoughtful. She kept flipping through the journals, pausing at certain passages and reading them with the kind of focused attention she usually reserved for work documents. "You were an interesting kid," she said eventually. "I was a weird kid," I corrected. "Too serious, too analytical, too worried about things I couldn't control." "Maybe," she said, but her tone suggested disagreement. "Or maybe you were just trying to understand a world that didn't make sense to you." That evening, while Sarah was taking a bath, I found myself reading the journals more carefully, trying to see what she had seen in those pages of adolescent confusion. What I found was a version of myself I had forgotten, someone who questioned everything, who looked for meaning in small details, who refused to accept surface explanations when deeper truths were available. Someone who would never have been satisfied with a relationship that felt more like performance than partnership. The past never really leaves us, does it? It follows us around like a shadow, shaping our reactions and expectations in ways we don't even recognize. Reading those journals, I remembered the boy who had promised himself he would never settle for anything less than genuine connection, who had sworn he would rather be alone than be with someone who didn't really see him. Somewhere along the way, I had forgotten that promise. I had allowed myself to be so grateful for Sarah's presence in my life that I had stopped asking whether her presence was authentic or just expertly performed. That night, I dreamed about being 13 again, sitting in my childhood bedroom and writing in one of those journals about the girl I would someday fall in love with. In the dream, I was warning my adult self about something important, something crucial that I needed to remember, but when I woke up, I could only recall the feeling of urgency, not the message itself. Sarah was already gone when I woke up, off to one of her mysterious Saturday errands that had become increasingly common. She'd left a note on the kitchen counter, "Gone shopping, back this afternoon," in her careful handwriting, and I found myself studying the words like they might contain coded information. I spent the morning reading more of my old journals, searching for clues about the person I used to be, the person who wouldn't have accepted easy answers or comfortable lies. And slowly, I began to understand what that 13-year-old boy had been trying to tell me in my dream. Some people wear masks to hide from others, but the most dangerous masks are the ones we wear to hide from ourselves. And sometimes, the person wearing the mask isn't the only one who forgets what's underneath. Sunday arrived grey and heavy, one of those December days when the light never quite manages to break through the clouds and everything feels suspended in perpetual twilight. Sarah had been quiet since finding my old journals, moving through our apartment with the careful deliberation of someone navigating a minefield. I had been carrying Alex's email around in my mind like a stone in my shoe, impossible to ignore, but painful to acknowledge. "You can't have both," the message had said, and I was beginning to understand that Sarah had been trying to have both for months, whatever both meant in the context of her secret communications and careful evasions. The confrontation, when it finally came, started over something completely mundane. Sarah was making coffee, and I noticed she was using the expensive beans she usually saved for special occasions. "What's the occasion?" I asked. She paused with the coffee grinder in her hands, and I saw something flicker across her face, guilt, maybe, or resignation. "No occasion, I just thought we should enjoy nice things." "We should enjoy nice things," I repeated, tasting the words for hidden meaning. That sounds like something someone says when they're trying to create a memory. Sarah set down the grinder and turned to face me fully, and I saw that she was done pretending. Whatever performance she had been maintaining for the past few months was finally exhausting her. "Michael," she said, and my name sounded different in her mouth, weighted with things she had been holding back. "We need to talk." The words I had been dreading and longing for in equal measure. I sat down at the kitchen table, in the same chair where I had been having my morning coffee and trying to make sense of our relationship for months. "Okay," I said, "let's talk." She poured 2 cups of coffee, the expensive kind that tasted too rich for ordinary Sunday mornings, and sat across from me in the chair she usually occupied, but instead of looking at me, she stared into her cup as if it contained answers to questions she didn't know how to ask. "I've been lying to you," she said finally, and the simple honesty of it was somehow more shocking than any elaborate confession could have been. "About what?" "About everything." She looked up then, and I saw tears in her eyes, the first genuine emotion she had shown me in months. "About who I am, about what I want, about why I'm with you." The kitchen fell silent except for the sound of the coffee maker finishing its cycle, a mundane noise that seemed absurdly normal given the magnitude of what Sarah was saying. "I don't understand," I said, though part of me was beginning to. "I've been pretending to be the person I thought you wanted me to be," she continued, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "From the very beginning, from that first night at Emily's party, I've been performing a version of myself that I thought would make you fall in love with me." "Why would you do that?" She was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was so soft I had to lean forward to hear her. Because I was terrified that if you knew who I really was, you wouldn't want me. I finally understood what I had to do. Not what I wanted to do, which was to rage and demand explanations and hurt her the way she had hurt me, but what I actually had to do, which was to listen to the rest of her truth, no matter how much it cost me. "Who are you really?" I asked. Sarah laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. "I don't know anymore. I've been Sarah who Michael would love for so long that I can't remember who Sarah actually is underneath all the performance." "What about Alex?" The question hung between us like a blade, sharp and dangerous. Sarah's face went pale, and I saw her calculate how much truth she was prepared to reveal. "Alex isn't what you think," she said finally. "Alex is my therapist." The relief was immediate and overwhelming, followed almost instantly by confusion and a new kind of hurt. "Your therapist?" "I've been seeing him for 6 months, trying to figure out why I can't stop lying to the person I'm supposed to love most." Her voice broke on the last word, and I realized she was crying in earnest now. "The email you saw, he was telling me I couldn't keep pretending to be someone else and also try to build a real relationship with you. I had to choose between the performance and the truth." I sat back in my chair, trying to process this new information. Sarah in therapy, Sarah struggling with identity, Sarah trying to figure out how to be authentic in a relationship she had built on careful deception. "Why didn't you just tell me?" I asked. "Because I was afraid you would leave," she said simply. "And I was right, wasn't I? Look at your face right now. You're already gone." I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time in months, I felt like I was seeing Sarah instead of the careful construction she had been presenting. Her hair was messy, her eyes were red from crying, and her composure was completely shattered. She looked human in a way that was both heartbreaking and oddly reassuring. "I'm not gone," I said, and realized it was true. "I'm here. For the first time in months, I feel like I'm actually here with you." But even as I said it, I knew something fundamental had shifted between us, something that couldn't be undone by explanations or apologies or even genuine tears. The foundation of our relationship had been built on Sarah's performance of compatibility, and now that the performance was over, neither of us knew what was left underneath. The hours that followed Sarah's confession felt like archaeological excavation, carefully brushing away layers of deception to reveal the artifacts of who we really were beneath the elaborate construction of who we had pretended to be. We sat at that kitchen table until the expensive coffee grew cold, and then we made more, and then we sat some more, slowly dismantling 2 years of careful lies. "Tell me about the real Sarah," I said, and I meant it as an invitation, not an interrogation. She was quiet for a long time, staring out the window at the gray December sky. "I don't know where to start," she said finally. "It's been so long since I was authentic with anyone, I'm not sure I remember how." "Start anywhere." "Okay." She took a shaky breath. "The real Sarah doesn't actually like most of the movies we've watched together. I kept suggesting films I thought you'd enjoy, and when you seemed to like them, I pretended I did too. It was such a small thing, but it hit me with disproportionate force. All those evenings we'd spent cuddled on the couch, sharing what I thought were genuine moments of connection, and she had been performing enjoyment of experiences that bored or annoyed her." "What movies do you actually like?" I asked. "Romantic comedies," she said, and there was something almost defiant in her voice. "Terrible, predictable romantic comedies with happy endings and no deeper meaning. The kind of movies you always said were formulaic and shallow." I remembered those conversations, my casual dismissals of entire genres that apparently brought Sarah joy. How many times had I unknowingly discouraged her from sharing something she actually cared about? "What else?" I asked. The confession continued for hours. Sarah revealed a version of herself that was messier, more emotional, less intellectually sophisticated than the woman I thought I'd been dating. She admitted to enjoying celebrity gossip, to crying during commercials, to having strong opinions about reality TV shows and pop music and other things I had unknowingly signaled were beneath serious consideration. "I wanted to be the kind of person you could respect," she said. "Someone smart and cultured and emotionally mature. Someone worthy of your attention." "But you are worthy of my attention," I said, and realized I was crying now too. "You always were. You just never gave me the chance to fall in love with the actual you." "Would you have, though?" The question was barely audible. "If you had met the real me at Emily's party, would you have been interested?" I tried to imagine it, meeting a Sarah who openly admitted to loving romantic comedies and reality TV, who cried easily and had strong feelings about things I considered trivial. Would I have been attracted to that person? Would I have seen her vulnerability as strength or as weakness? The honest answer was uncomfortable. I didn't know. The person I had been 2 years ago, the person who valued control and intellectual compatibility above emotional authenticity, might not have given the real Sarah a chance. I think, I said carefully, that the person I was when we met wasn't ready for someone real. I was looking for someone who would fit into my life without requiring me to change or grow or question anything about myself. And I was so desperate to be loved that I was willing to disappear completely to become that person. Sarah wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. We were perfect for each other, in the most unhealthy way possible. Everything I thought I knew was wrong. Our entire relationship had been built on mutual self-deception, my need for uncomplicated compatibility and her need for unconditional acceptance. We had created a dynamic that satisfied our neuroses while preventing any actual intimacy or growth. The therapy, I said. When did you start realizing that this wasn't working? About 6 months ago. I was lying in bed one night, listening to you sleep, and I realized I had no idea who I was anymore. I had become so good at being your girlfriend that I had completely lost track of being Sarah. She smiled sadly. Alex helped me understand that I was grieving for myself, for the person I had abandoned to become someone I thought you could love. I thought about those months when I had sensed Sarah pulling away, when I had attributed her distance to work stress or normal relationship changes. She had been doing the painful work of excavating her authentic self, and I had been too focused on maintaining our comfortable dynamic to notice or support her process. Why didn't you break up with me? I asked. If you realized the relationship was built on lies, why try to fix it instead of just ending it? Because somewhere in the middle of all that pretending, I actually did fall in love with you. Her voice was thick with tears again. Not the you I was performing for, but the real you I caught glimpses of when you thought no one was looking. The you who writes thoughtful emails to his sister, who remembers what his friends are worried about, who cries during documentaries about injustice. The you who reads his old journals and remembers what it felt like to believe in authentic connection. The irony was devastating. While Sarah was falling in love with glimpses of my authentic self, I had been falling in love with her performance of the perfect girlfriend. We had been standing right next to each other, loving different people entirely. So what happens now? I asked, though I was beginning to understand that there was no path forward that didn't involve all fundamental change or fundamental loss. I don't know, Sarah said. I'm still figuring out who I am when I'm not trying to be who someone else wants me to be. And you're going to have to decide whether you can love someone who's messier and more complicated than the person you thought you were dating. We sat in silence then, both of us processing the magnitude of what needed to happen next. The relationship we had built was over. It had been over the moment Sarah decided to stop performing, but the relationship we might build in its place was still an unknown quantity, full of risks neither of us was sure we were brave enough to take. The week that followed our kitchen table confession passed in a strange suspension of time, as if Sarah and I were existing in the space between our old relationship dying and whatever came next being born. We moved around each other carefully, like strangers sharing temporary accommodation, polite and considerate but uncertain about boundaries and expectations. Sarah had started being aggressively authentic in ways that were both refreshing and disorienting. She suggested we watch a romantic comedy for our Friday night movie, then cried openly during the predictably happy ending. She played pop music while cooking dinner and sang along without self-consciousness. She expressed opinions about current events that were emotional rather than analytical, rooted in feeling rather than careful reasoning. It was like living with a completely different person, except this person had Sarah's face and Sarah's laugh and Sarah's way of arranging throw pillows just so. The cognitive dissonance was exhausting. "This is weird for you," she observed one evening while we were eating takeout Thai food that she had chosen based on what she actually wanted rather than what she thought I would prefer. "It's not weird," I said, though it absolutely was. "It's just different." "You can say it's weird, Michael. I know this is weird. I'm basically asking you to start dating a stranger who happens to live in your girlfriend's body." The directness of her observation was startling. The old Sarah would have deflected or softened such a statement, would have found a way to make me feel better about my discomfort rather than simply acknowledging it. "Okay, it's weird," I admitted, But weird doesn't necessarily mean bad. Family reactions to our situation varied in ways that revealed more about each person than about our relationship itself. Emily, when I finally told her what was happening, was surprisingly supportive of Sarah's authenticity experiment. "I always thought there was something performative about her," she said during one of our coffee dates. "Not in a malicious way, just in a way that felt effortful, like she was working very hard to be likable." "Did you think I should break up with her?" I asked. "I thought you should figure out whether you were in love with Sarah or in love with the idea of having a girlfriend who never caused any problems." Emily stirred her latte thoughtfully. "Now you get to find out." David, predictably, was more analytical. "The question isn't whether you can adjust to dating the real Sarah," he said during a phone call that lasted longer than most of our in-person visits. "The question is whether either of you has developed the emotional skills necessary for authentic intimacy." "What do you mean?" "You've both been practicing avoidance for 2 years. Sarah avoided being herself, and you avoided dealing with anyone who might challenge your comfortable assumptions about relationships. Now you're both going to have to learn how to be vulnerable and imperfect and still choose each other." Mrs. Johnson's reaction was the most surprising. When I explained the situation during one of our weekly check-ins, she was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "I think," she said carefully, "that Sarah is very brave." "Brave? It takes enormous courage to risk losing someone you love by showing them who you really are. Most people would rather maintain a comfortable lie than face the possibility of authentic rejection." "But she lied to me for 2 years, Mom, about fundamental things, about who she is as a person." "Yes, she did, and that was wrong, and I'm sure it's painful for you to realize how much of your relationship was based on her performance rather than genuine compatibility." Mom's voice carried the kind of gentle firmness she had used when I was younger and trying to avoid difficult truths. "But now she's telling you the truth, even though it might cost her everything she spent 2 years building. That's not nothing, sweetheart." Some truths are too heavy to carry alone, and I was beginning to understand that what Sarah and I were facing couldn't be resolved through individual processing or personal growth. We needed to figure out together whether two people who had never practiced authentic intimacy could learn how to love each other without the safety net of performance and pretense. The conversation that would determine our future happened on a Tuesday night in late December, almost 3 weeks after Sarah's initial confession. We had been circling around the central question for days, whether to try to build something real from the ruins of what we'd had, or whether to accept that some foundations are too damaged to support anything lasting. "I need to know," I said while we were cleaning up after dinner, "whether you think this is fixable." Sarah set down the dish she was drying and looked at me with the kind of direct attention I was still learning not to find unsettling. "What would fixed look like to you?" "I don't know. A relationship where we both get to be ourselves without having to perform compatibility. Where we can disagree about things without it feeling like a threat to our connection. Where we can be messy and imperfect and still choose each other." "That sounds wonderful," she said. "It also sounds terrifying." "Why terrifying?" "Because what if we try to be authentic with each other and discover that we actually don't like who the other person really is? What if the reason our relationship worked was because we were both pretending to be more compatible than we actually are?" The question hung between us like a challenge, daring us to risk everything we had built for the possibility of something better. It would have been easier to continue our careful dance around the truth, to gradually drift apart in the socially acceptable way that couples do when they're too comfortable to fight, but not happy enough to grow. But I was beginning to understand that easy wasn't the same as good, and comfortable wasn't the same as fulfilling. "Then we'll find out," I said, "and we'll deal with whatever we discover." Sarah smiled then, the first completely unguarded smile I had seen from her in months. "Okay," she said, "let's find out." January brought the hard work of reconstruction, the daily practice of trying to build authentic intimacy between two people who had spent 2 years expertly avoiding it. Sarah and I approached our relationship like archaeologists, carefully excavating our real preferences and opinions and reactions from beneath the accumulated sediment of performance and accommodation. Some discoveries were delightful. I learned that Sarah had strong opinions about coffee preparation methods and wasn't afraid to criticize my technique. She learned that I actually enjoyed the romantic comedies she had been secretly wanting to watch, though for different reasons than she did. We found common ground in unexpected places and fundamental differences in areas where we had assumed compatibility. Other revelations were more challenging. Sarah's authentic emotional responses were more intense and less predictable than her carefully modulated performances had been. She cried more easily, laughed more loudly, got frustrated about things that seemed minor to me. I discovered that my preference for emotional stability had been less about maturity and more about control. I was uncomfortable with feelings I couldn't predict or manage. "You shut down when I get upset about things you think are stupid," Sarah observed one evening after a disagreement about a news story that had made her cry. "It's like you can't handle any emotion that doesn't make logical sense to you." She was right, and the realization was uncomfortable. I had been congratulating myself on being rational and level-headed, but what I had actually been doing was dismissing any emotional experience that challenged my need for everything to be reasonable and controllable. "I'm working on it," I said, which had become my standard response to observations about my emotional limitations. "I know you are, but I need you to understand that working on it isn't enough. I need you to actually get better at it." The directness of her statement was still startling after months of careful diplomacy. The new Sarah said what she meant and meant what she said, without the layers of cushioning and qualification that had characterized her previous communication style. I had to decide who I wanted to be in response to this new version of Sarah, this person who demanded authentic engagement rather than comfortable accommodation. It would have been easy to retreat into the familiar patterns of our old dynamic, to become frustrated with her messiness and long for the uncomplicated girlfriend she used to pretend to be. Instead, I found myself rising to meet her authenticity with my own. I started admitting when I was confused or hurt or overwhelmed. I stopped trying to solve her emotional experiences and started simply witnessing them. I learned to sit with discomfort instead of immediately trying to fix it. "You're different too," Sarah said one night while we were lying in bed, the space between us neither intimate nor distant, but something entirely new. "More present, more willing to be confused about things. Is that good or bad?" "It's real," she said. "It's the first time I've felt like I was in bed with Michael instead of with someone performing the role of Sarah's boyfriend." Emily noticed the changes during one of our coffee dates in late January. "You seem less settled," she observed. "More engaged with uncertainty." "Is that a compliment?" "I think so. You used to approach relationships like engineering problems, find the right components, assemble them correctly, and you'd get a predictable result. Now you seem to understand that relationships are more like improvisational jazz. You have to learn to work with whatever comes up in the moment." The metaphor made me think about all the ways I had tried to control my relationship with Sarah, how I had mistaken her willingness to accommodate my preferences for genuine compatibility. Real partnership, I was learning, required a tolerance for surprises, for discoveries that changed the fundamental dynamics of how two people related to each other. David was more skeptical of our reconstruction project. "The question isn't whether you can learn to accept Sarah's authentic self," he said during one of our increasingly philosophical phone conversations. "The question is whether you can build trust with someone who lied to you about fundamental things for 2 years." It was a fair point, and one that I wrestled with regularly. There were moments when Sarah would express a strong opinion or emotional reaction, and I would find myself wondering whether this was the real Sarah or just another version of performance designed to convince me she was being authentic. "How do I know when you're being genuine?" I asked her one evening, and immediately regretted the question when I saw the hurt flash across her face. "You don't," she said simply. "That's what trust is, choosing to believe someone when you can't be certain they're telling the truth. I can't prove my authenticity to you, Michael. You either believe I'm doing the work to be real with you, or you don't." I was beginning to understand that certainty was a luxury that our relationship could no longer afford. We had blown up the foundation of comfortable predictability, and now we had to learn to love each other in the space of not knowing, in the territory where trust was a daily choice rather than a settled assumption. "I want to believe you," I said. "That's enough for now," she replied. "We'll figure out the rest as we go." By February, Sarah and I had developed what we jokingly called the practice, a daily commitment to choosing authenticity over comfort, truth over performance, uncertainty over the illusion of control. It was exhausting work, like learning to speak a new language while forgetting the old one, but it was also oddly exhilarating. We had established new rituals to replace the old ones. Instead of automatically agreeing on weekend activities, we practiced stating our actual preferences and negotiating genuine compromises. Instead of avoiding topics that might lead to conflict, we leaned into disagreements as opportunities to understand each other better. Instead of assuming compatibility, we approached each interaction with curiosity about what we might discover. "This is the hardest thing I've ever done," Sarah said one evening while we were attempting to plan a vacation together, something that had previously been effortless but now required extensive negotiation about our different travel styles and preferences. "Harder than therapy?" I asked. "Therapy was about figuring out who I am when I'm not performing for someone else. This is about learning to be that person in relationship with another actual person who has their own needs and reactions and limitations." She looked up from the travel websites we had been scrolling through. "It turns out authentic intimacy is really complicated." She wasn't wrong. Every interaction had become an exercise in conscious choice rather than automatic reaction. We had to actively decide to extend trust rather than assuming it. We had to deliberately choose vulnerability instead of defaulting to self-protection. We had to practice seeing each other clearly instead of through the filters of our expectations and assumptions. Jessica, who had been watching our relationship transformation with fascination and concern, finally asked the why. A question I had been dreading. "Are you sure this is sustainable? Because from the outside, it looks like you're both working incredibly hard just to stay together." We were sitting in a coffee shop near Sarah's office, one of our newly instituted monthly check-ins, where Sarah practiced being authentic with her oldest friend while I learned to trust her to represent our relationship honestly. "All relationships require work," Sarah said, but there was uncertainty in her voice. "We're just doing it more consciously than we used to." "But should love feel this effortful?" Jessica pressed. "I mean, yes, relationships take work, but the foundation should feel natural, shouldn't it? You shouldn't have to practice being compatible with someone you're planning to spend your life with." The question followed me home and settled into my mind like an uncomfortable houseguest. Was our commitment to authenticity actually a sign of incompatibility? Were we working so hard to make our relationship function because we were fundamentally wrong for each other? I brought the question to Emily during our next coffee date, hoping for her characteristic clarity about complicated emotional situations. "I think," she said after considering Jessica's concern, "that you and Sarah are learning to have a relationship for the first time. The work you're doing isn't about forcing compatibility, it's about developing the skills you need for genuine intimacy. But what if we develop those skills and discover we still don't really work together?" "Then you'll know," Emily said simply. "And you'll both be better equipped for relationships with other people. But right now, you're building something that most couples never even attempt. That has to count for something." The conversation with Emily helped me understand that Sarah and I weren't just trying to save our specific relationship, we were learning how to be in relationship at all. The skills we were developing, the uncomfortable growth we were experiencing, the daily practice of choosing each other despite uncertainty, these were the foundations of adult love, not the obstacles to it. Sometimes love means knowing when to let go, but sometimes it means learning to hold on differently. Sarah and I were discovering that there was a third option between the comfortable lie of our original dynamic and the painful honesty of complete separation, the difficult truth of staying together while becoming different people. "I've been thinking about Jessica's question," Sarah said one night while we were doing dishes, a task that had become one of our most productive conversation spaces, "about whether love should feel this effortful. And I think maybe we've been confusing effort with suffering. Learning to be authentic with each other is work, but it's not painful work. It's like learning to play a musical instrument, challenging and sometimes frustrating, but ultimately joyful." She paused in her dish drying to look at me directly. "I don't feel like I'm forcing myself to be compatible with you anymore. I feel like I'm learning to be myself in relationship with another person who's also learning to be himself. That's not the same thing." I realized she was right. The work we were doing didn't feel like trying to fit square pegs into round holes. It felt like two people learning to dance together, awkward at first, requiring patience and practice, but ultimately creating something beautiful that neither could achieve alone. "So we keep practicing?" I asked. "We keep practicing," she agreed, "until it stops feeling like practice and starts feeling like just how we love each other." That night, I lay awake thinking about the journey we had taken from performance to authenticity, from comfortable lies to difficult truths. We had destroyed the relationship we thought we wanted and were slowly building something we hadn't known we needed. It was messier, more uncertain, and infinitely more real than what we had before. The future remained unknown, full of discoveries we couldn't predict and challenges we hadn't yet learned to navigate, but for the first time in our relationship, that uncertainty felt like possibility rather than threat. Spring arrived with the kind of gentle insistence that makes you believe in new beginnings, even when you know better than to trust seasonal metaphors. Sarah and I had been practicing authentic relationship for 6 months, and while we hadn't achieved anything resembling mastery, we had developed something more valuable, the confidence that we could handle whatever we discovered about ourselves and each other. The revelation came, as most important realizations do, during an ordinary moment that became extraordinary through attention and timing. We were grocery shopping, a mundane activity that had become surprisingly complex as we learned to navigate our different approaches to meal planning, budgeting, and decision-making, when Sarah stopped in the middle of the produce section and looked at me with an expression I couldn't immediately read. "What?" I asked, wondering if I had unconsciously made one of the faces she had learned to recognize as judgment or frustration. "I just realized something," she said, holding a bunch of asparagus like it was evidence of profound truth. "I'm not afraid of you anymore." The statement hit me with unexpected force. "You were afraid of me?" "Not afraid of you hurting me," she clarified, setting the asparagus in our cart with deliberate care. "Afraid of you seeing me, really seeing me. For 2 years, I lived in constant terror that you would notice something about me that would make you realize I wasn't worth loving." She paused, considering her words carefully in the way she had learned to do when emotions were running high. "But right now, standing here in the grocery store while you make that face you make when you're trying to decide whether we need more coffee, I'm not afraid. If you saw everything about me, all my messiness and neuroses and terrible taste in music, and decided I wasn't worth the effort, it would hurt, but it wouldn't destroy me." I looked at her standing there among the vegetables, her hair escaping from the ponytail she had hastily constructed that morning, wearing the old sweater that she loved despite its multiple small holes, and I felt something shift in my chest like a puzzle piece finally finding its proper place. "I've been afraid too," I said, and realized it was true. Afraid that if I let myself need you, really need you, not just appreciate the convenient companionship, you would leave. Afraid that authentic intimacy would be too messy and demanding for me to handle. "Are you still afraid?" I considered the question seriously, taking inventory of my emotional state while shoppers moved around us in their own private worlds of domestic decision-making. "Less afraid," I said finally. "Still sometimes overwhelmed by how complicated you are, but not afraid of the complication anymore." That evening, we sat on our couch, the same couch where we had spent countless nights watching movies we didn't both enjoy, having conversations that skimmed the surface of who we really were, and tried to articulate what we had built from the ruins of our original relationship. "We're not the same people who met at Emily's party," Sarah observed, curled against my side in a way that felt both familiar and entirely new. "Do you miss who we used to be?" I asked. She was quiet for a long moment, and I had learned not to rush her processing time, not to interpret silence as avoidance or rejection. "I miss how easy it used to be," she said finally. "I miss believing that love was about finding someone who required no adjustment or growth from you. I miss thinking that compatibility was about never having to negotiate or compromise or sit with discomfort. But I don't miss disappearing. I don't miss feeling like I was living someone else's life, even if that life was easier than my own." She turned to look at me directly. "Do you miss the version of me that never disagreed with you about anything important?" The honest answer was complicated. There were moments when I longed for the simplicity of our old dynamic, when Sarah's emotional complexity felt overwhelming and I yearned for the predictable ease of her previous performance, but there were more moments when I felt grateful for the privilege of knowing her actual thoughts and feelings, even when they challenged my assumptions or required me to reconsider my positions. "Sometimes," I admitted, "but mostly I'm grateful to finally be in a relationship with you instead of with a carefully constructed version of who you thought I wanted you to be." We had learned that authentic love was not about finding someone who never required you to grow or change or question your comfortable assumptions. It was about finding someone worth growing for, someone whose real self inspired you to become more real yourself. "I love you," Sarah said, and the words carried a weight they had never held during our performance phase. "Not because you're perfect or because we're perfectly compatible, but because you're willing to keep figuring out how to love me as I actually am." "I love you too," I said, and meant it in a way that encompassed all the mess and uncertainty and daily choice that real love required. Life has a way of teaching us what we need to learn, though rarely in the timeline or manner we expect. Sarah and I had thought we were building a relationship based on compatibility and shared values, but what we had actually been creating was an elaborate avoidance of intimacy. It took the near destruction of everything we thought we wanted to discover what we actually needed: the courage to be seen, the strength to see clearly, and the faith that love could survive the truth. 6 months later, we still practiced authenticity daily. We still negotiated differences that we had once pretended didn't exist. We still chose each other despite uncertainty, trusted each other despite risk, and built our future on the foundation of not knowing rather than the illusion of certainty. But we were no longer afraid of what we might discover about ourselves or each other. We had learned that the most dangerous secrets are the ones we keep from ourselves, and that the most powerful love is the kind that sees clearly and chooses anyway. In the end, Sarah hadn't played with my heart. We had both been playing roles that prevented either of us from accessing our hearts at all. The secret that shattered her perfect world was the same one that shattered mine: that perfect worlds are prisons, and real love can only exist in the territory of authentic imperfection. We chose the territory, we chose each other, we chose the daily practice of becoming real together, one honest conversation at a time, and somehow, impossibly, it was enough.